I'm Isabella Jackson, Assistant Professor in Chinese History at Trinity College Dublin. So my expertise are in the past, so I'll be deferring to the panellists that I'm chairing and moderating today for their expertise on the present. So I'll introduce them to you in alphabetical order, beginning with Finbarr Bermingham, who reports on Europe-China relations for the South China Morning Post, which is, if you don't know, Hong Kong's primary English language newspaper, which he joined in 2018. After a decade based in Hong Kong, he took up the role of Europe correspondent and moved to Brussels. He hosted the Post's US-China Trade War Update weekly podcast from 2019, and he now hosts the China Geopolitics podcast. To my right here is Alexander Davey, an analyst at MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce him because I taught him nearly a decade ago when he took the Masters in Chinese Studies at Trinity College. But since then, he's had a really exciting career. He's published on Ireland's approach to China and is preparing a report on Ireland's de-risking its relations with China. So that's some of the topics that we'll be discussing this morning. He also has expertise on the Chinese Communist Party's political discourse and organization, policy making, and its impact on China's domestic and international behavior. To my left, Yvonne Murray has been the global security reporter based in New York for RTE News since December 22. She previously reported for RTE News on Chinese affairs from China and then from Taipei when we spoke first, as well as reporting for the BBC, Channel 4 News, and The Economist. As many of you will know, in March 2021, Murray and her family were forced to leave China after 10 years living there amid concerns for the safety of her husband, John Sudworth, who was then China correspondent for BBC News. So that personal story, I think, should come into our discussion, as well as drawing on your expertise, Yvonne. And finally, Ben Tonra is full professor of international relations at the UCD School of Politics and International Relations. He teaches, researches, and publishes on Irish and European foreign, security, and defense policy and international relations theory. Ben is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and has previously served as the chair of the Academy's Standing Committee on International Affairs. You're very welcome. I know from our discussions we're going to have a great conversation this morning. I was asked to flag to you all anyone who's on Twitter, which I refuse to call X. If you would like to tweet about today's events and discussions, you're welcome to do so, and we'd ask you to use the hashtag IRLChina for Ireland China. And hopefully that will help bring some of the discussion to a wider audience virtually. The brief we were given for this panel was to really address the things that everyone should know about the Ireland-China relationship. So a lot of the themes have already come up in the great lectures and addresses we had this morning already. So we're going to try and drill into some more detail with some of those things and then expand the conversation out from there. So I'll begin, if I may, with Yvonne. And let's start on a positive note. What advantages do you see Ireland has in its dealings with China?
Okay, well, Ireland has many advantages in that it is a neutral state, first of all. So it's less threatening for China. It is not seen as allied with any particular alliance. It's seen as something of an independent actor. In recent years, though, given Europe has been hardening its line on China, Ireland has followed suit on that. And I think that there is a sense here amongst China officials, there's a worry that Ireland is now going to go down that route. And that is something of a concern. And I think we can see an attempt, perhaps with Li Qiang's visit earlier this year, to make sure that they keep Ireland on side, keep it friendly, and not fall too much into what the US is pursuing with regard to China policy and the hardening policy in Europe. So that's the positive side. I think as a reporter in China, I think it's really important to note that access for reporters has become more and more difficult. So we're now suffering from a situation where there are very few people on the ground who can give you an up-to-date appraisal of how Chinese officials are viewing Ireland or any other country for that matter. I think that has led to a real dearth of information. I kick myself on a daily basis about it because I used to be a China reporter and was forced out. I feel terribly guilty that I'm not there at the coalface still reporting what I consider the most important story of our time. And we can get into a little bit of how we try to address that. But in terms of trying to present up-to-date information about how China views Ireland and how Chinese officials particularly view Ireland, I would do a better job if I was there on the ground.
Of course, inevitably. And perhaps I could turn to Alexander to pick up on that, and specifically in the context of what's been mentioned already, Micheál Martin's speeches on China last year. He called for sectors across the country to assess their ties with China. What would that look like? Has it happened at all? And what is needed here?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's important to look at why was that speech made at that time, why we'd never spoken publicly about China in this way. And it was important to notice that it's happened soon after Biden's visit and Ursula von der Leyen's speech last March about the European Union's need to de-risk its relations with China. The speech in itself was mainly a rhetorical device to signal to Brussels, Washington DC and Beijing that there is an alignment within Ireland with the EU-China policy. But there's also another reason why it happened, because in the last few years we had quite a few shocks with our relationship with China, which we didn't have before, which was something that was unexpected and unforeseen by the Irish government. And I can briefly name those. That was the 3-year exit ban put on Richard O'Halloran, who was involved with aviation leasing and trying to solve a business dispute and was kept in Shanghai for 3 years. The second one was the Fuzhou Overseas Police Service Station on Capel Street, what it said to offer services to Chinese citizens in Ireland for getting their driving license reissued, but a report from I think a Safeguard Defenders showed that there may have been some other instances that such overseas police service stations were used for. And finally, the immigration investment program that Ireland set up as a way to bring in revenue after the 2008 financial crash. And most importantly about that is that over 95% of the applicants, that is over 1,500 of more than 1,600 applicants, were Chinese nationals for this program, where over a million euro is needed to invest into a specific sector. And so these 3 instances are also what caused Ireland to be, rather than being passive, to be more actively accepting EU-China policy.
Thank you very much. Turning to Ben now, what are Ireland's national security vulnerabilities when it comes to China? We've mentioned the Chinese Police Bureau operating here. What about Chinese investment in Ireland and the presence of major Chinese technical companies like Huawei, and any other concerns that you may have with your expertise?
Well, I think you start from the position that Irish diplomacy has been extraordinarily adroit. If you're of a more cynical disposition, you might say it's duplicitous, in as much as Ireland manages to present itself as a culturally familiar bridgehead for high-tech US investment, and at the same time as a China-friendly bridgehead into Europe. It manages to present itself as a champion of international human rights, and yet issues sometimes, very often, only the most pro forma condemnations of human rights violations by China. It presents itself as a champion of the multilateral system in a small state, and yet miraculously has been unable or unwilling thus far to reopen its representative office in Taipei, which was originally closed ostensibly for economic reasons, which clearly no longer apply. But I think the biggest issue for Ireland in terms of the national security aspect is in respect specifically of high tech. I mean, in terms of the type and scale of US investment that we have seen, in terms also of sort of native Irish industrial development in some high-tech areas and sectors from Irish SMEs, Ireland has no national security culture. It has no national security infrastructure. It has no national security conversation. We have no national security agency. We have no counter-espionage capacity. We have no system for national security clearance in this country, which has meant specifically Irish academics, for example, kept out of EU expert groups because they can't get national security clearance. We have seen Irish universities excluded from consortia competing for EU funding in the security and defence realm because those institutions can't get national security clearance. All of that suggests to me that Ireland has a national security problem, not specific to China, but universally. It is acute in respect of authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, and it is something, unfortunately, that the Irish state is simply failing to deal with.
Thank you. You mentioned previously when we were talking about this, the example of the Chinese citizen.
I don't want to get into specific individuals, but we have had, for example, an individual who was working with an Irish state agency in the aerospace area. The individual had a ostensibly glittering career here, moved off to Australia, got a similar job in Australia, and was almost immediately flagged as a Russian agent. I have heard from Irish SMEs dealing with Irish state agencies saying, oh, you know what, there was an odd person in the room, a foreign national, I don't know where they're from, I don't know what their background is, but I know that that person does not have a national security clearance because there is no national security clearance, and I am anxious about sharing my IP in a context that I'm not sure of its security. That is endemic, it is organic, and it is an abject failure of the Irish state.
Thank you. And to bring Finbarr into the conversation and flip our view a little bit, how do Chinese officials view Ireland, and what is the significance? It's already come up, but could you drill into it a little bit more of Ireland's role within the EU for China?
Yeah, I wish Chinese officials would talk to me more so I could answer that question properly. So what I did is I ran it up the flagpole and I asked my boss, who's been a China watcher and a China reporter for 30 years, and he says, well, I mean, Ireland's a very small country. China doesn't really think about small countries very much. It's the Middle Kingdom. It expects these small countries to come and sort of pay homage. And he says, but there must be something in there. Each of these countries with which, you know, you see all the time photos of Xi Jinping, like doing military inspections with the president of Suriname or of Micronesia. There is a utility in each of these. And so there must be utility for Ireland, and you can see that as others have mentioned today in the visit of Li Chang earlier in the year. Just to sort of drill into how rare it is that Li Chang came to went overseas. He hasn't left China since that. He went to Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, and then he went to Ireland. So it was the only other country that he visited. It was a state visit. Prior to that, he'd been in Kyrgyzstan in October for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, meeting with the likes of Iran, Russia, and so on. And I think before that, he'd been at the G20 in India and another international forum in Indonesia. So it's incredibly rare for the Chinese premier to go on a bilateral visit to another country. So there obviously is something in why he came to Ireland. And my sense is, if you look at Xi Jinping's visit to Europe earlier this month, these diplomatic events are organised in where they basically consider to be safe spaces. Yes, Xi went to France where he had to listen to a few tough questions from von der Leyen and Macron, but he also knows that the French are desperate for Chinese investment into the electric vehicle sector, and so on like that. From there, he went to Serbia and Hungary. So it's important to look at the visit of Li Chang in that context. Ireland is important to China in the sense that it is an EU member. It has an equal say at the EU table with others, and it's also a very open economy, open to Chinese investment. There was an incident a few years ago. We all know the companies that are here, right? We don't need to go through them, but one photo in particular struck me 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, when Leo Varadkar was pictured at the opening of a Huawei Cloud Computing Center in October 2022, shaking hands with the representatives of Huawei, which is totally fine, but you would not have seen that photo taking place in a mainland European country with the exception of Hungary. So there's where I think China sees the utility of Ireland. It is an EU member. It is, of course, like on board nominally with the de-risking agenda, but I don't think it is desperately keen on some of the tenets of that, and I think China is fully aware of that. You know, when I was reporting in Brussels about some of the elements of de-risking, like outbound investment screening, even inbound investment screening. Ireland has, I think, have we implemented it now in the second quarter of 2014, but 4 years later than most other parts of Europe. So I think China is aware of this. It understands that, you know, it's important to have European member states on side. These are dwindling, right? That China doesn't have that many good friends in Europe anymore. So there's where the utility of Ireland is, and I think that's where that's how Chinese officials view Ireland. It's exclusively through that sort of safe space, utility, a part of Europe that's quite peripheral in terms of the security and geopolitical debate, but very much at the table on the economic side.
And can I just carry on that point? I think Chinese officials really appreciate the fact that Ireland refuses to practice what they call megaphone diplomacy, which was the phrase that I constantly I heard from Irish diplomats in Beijing. We don't practice megaphone diplomacy. Of course they do on Palestine, but when it comes to China, it's very much a different story. And that means that they are much less outspoken in a Chinese context. And we saw that, Dimitri referred to this in his talk earlier on. The clear-eyed speech that Taoiseach gave a year before his visit to China was very, very clear and very pointed. When he got to China, the line was softened to such an extent it could have been a different man altogether. And China is very appreciative of that. Have your views, but for God's sake, don't shout about it, and we'll all be friends. So I think that's where Ireland really benefits from what they perceive as friendliness.
Can I just say something in response to that? Like, if you look at some of the, say, like, I hate this phrase, but like-minded partners of Ireland and Europe on various issues. So you've got sort of the really pro-business member states like the Swedes, like the Czechs, like some of the Baltics. They all have actually quite difficult relationships with China as well, over human rights issue, over the coercion in Lithuania. Czechs are very close to the Taiwanese. Ireland is kind of on its own in a sense as a super pro-business member of the European Union that still has very cordial relations, very, let's say, uncontroversial relations with China. It hasn't really had a huge fight. I mean, I remember being shocked when Alex and folks like that were posting these stories about Huawei's involvement in, there was that Irish Times thing a couple of years ago about Huawei kicking off about being flagged as a national security risk in Ireland and so on. And it struck me as amazing that Ireland was only getting to this debate in 2021. Like in the rest of Europe, it was maybe 4 or 5 years earlier. So I think Ireland is obviously an island, we all know that. But I think in policy terms, it's somewhat of an island as well. It's a little bit isolated and peripheral.
Thank you. Could we talk a little bit more about Ireland's key economic dependencies on China? Semiconductors, microchips have already been mentioned, but I know this has been something you've worked on, Alexander. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think during my research last year, in the chapter I published in a report on different European nations' approach to China, that looking at Ireland's trade numbers, I was very surprised to see that of the 13 billion euro of export of goods to China, that over 8 billion were coming from semiconductor chips, more specifically integrated circuits. And I was trying to look into where does that come from, who are the players, and it's mainly from US multinational companies, or one in particular, Intel. And the volume of trade plays such a substantial proportion of Ireland's exports to China that I was surprised that it hadn't really come up. But there actually had been a journalist, Yvonne Murray from the Business Post, who brought it up a number of years ago, but he even said there wasn't much traction on that. What's important to know about that is when we look at Ireland's relationship with China and we talk about de-risking, it's about how are we connected to China. That's mainly economically speaking. Economically, what does that mean? The first and most fundamental basis is that Ireland is a foreign direct investment economy. And that means that we bring in companies from abroad, and traditionally that has been the US. And what it has been in the last few years, there seems to be a diversification away from a dependency on the US, which is quite ironic because we're all talking about diversifying and away from China, but what Ireland was, what appears to be doing was diversifying away from the US and bringing Chinese companies into Ireland. And what that's done is that you have US companies in Ireland and Chinese companies in Ireland that are very much linked to between Ireland and China relations. And so when we talk about Ireland's trade and we talk about investment in Ireland, it is very much linked to Chinese and US companies based in Ireland. And I think that's something that isn't really spoken about. In order to de-risk, to come back to this idea of de-risking, it's about dealing with that. Now Ireland, like Finbarr said, is we're trying to deal with this through a foreign direct investment screening mechanism, which as the latest is the second quarter of 2024, but I haven't seen anything online if that's been implemented. And then we have an update to on exports, the screening of exports, and that is an update of an older act, and it is about items produced in Ireland that have may be used for multiple purposes, what we call dual use. Now that has also come into effect. Whether these tools have been used, there's no evidence so far, and also I don't know to what extent that would be published publicly. But what's most important to notice is that last year we exported over 8 billion euro in integrated circuits to China, and the latest data, in 2022 we exported, and then in 2023 that has dropped 5 billion euro. So if you look at 13 billion being exported in goods to China, 8 billion being integrated circuits, and if that's dropped 5 billion to 3 billion, that's a big chunk. That's over a third of our investment or of our exporting goods to China dropped last year, and that's as a result of US-China relations and US companies and Chinese companies operating in Ireland. And so my thesis is that Ireland has become a site for US-China competition, and it's very important for Ireland to look about how to manage that and how to deal with that appropriately.
Can I just flag something? I was looking on the Chinese customs website this morning and doing a bit of research. The second, as you do, the second, as I do far too much, the second largest Irish export to China over the first 4 months of this year was vaccinations. Something like 1.7 billion, not far off actually what the level was for semiconductors. And so we see the Chinese medical company has a huge presence in Louth. And you wonder how much of that is also sort of risky. So if your top two exports totaling 4 billion, a huge amount of money for Ireland are going to be caught in the crosshairs of this growing sort of US-China rivalry, is probably something we should be looking at.
Yeah. And we should be looking at that rather than what got all the coverage in the media here was lifting the ban on Irish beef, which is tiny, but that was what people were interested in because of Ireland's perception of itself, perhaps. These are the big exports. This is what should be talking about, and it just wasn't really in the media conversation.
This is a problem in Europe in terms of, not to say farmers are a problem, but they kind of are. And as we're all anticipating in Brussels at the moment, what will be the retaliation from China in terms of the electric vehicle probe, which is due to finish in the first week of June. Everybody's thinking it's going to be French cognac, and possibly like Spanish prawns. They always go after agricultural produce because farmers vote, and they come to Brussels in their tractors and they spray on nasty stuff on the walls and so on. So it's the agri stuff is always so heavily weighted in the Europe-China relationship as well. It's quite a narrow in terms of the overall numbers, but it plays an outsized role.
If I could just chime in here. Yeah, when I looked at the data for 2022, I was also shocked because you see in the trips of Irish officials to China that the Minister for Agriculture is often and regularly going to China, and it's one of the strongest links between departments or ministerial leaders. When you look at the data, Ireland's agriculture exports to China make up a 4% share of the total of export in goods to China. So there is a mismatch between the value of goods and the level and intensity of relations on agricultural products. And I think that Finbarr was getting to a really interesting point about retaliation by the Chinese state with regard to specific agricultural products. And this is something that happens where different countries are always looking to get market access, and then if there's something going wrong, for whatever reason, access may be cut off, and another European country will jump in and say, oh yeah, great, Ireland's pork exports to China are gone, Denmark will jump in. And there's a severe lack of coordination between European countries, especially when it comes to agriculture, because it's such an easy thing to divide and conquer, because there's just this eagerness to get market access to China, especially which doesn't make sense to me when only 4% of the total value of exports.
Calculate the ratio of voting from rural parts of Ireland to the to the value of the export, and it would be an interesting study.
Yeah, for sure. I don't. That mismatch between government relations and agriculture, I think, is something to be aware of. Yeah.
Can I just say on pork exports, because I once calculated this for a story I was writing, if you were to gather up the entirety of Ireland's annual output of pork and send it to China, it would last half a day. That's how big that market is.
And it is interesting about the kind of media narrative here, and as you say, Finbarr, the importance of votes to skewing what's getting attention. There's a disadvantage of democracies that China doesn't have to deal with. They can be more strategic in the things that they care about and not worry so much about appealing to public opinion. Maybe we could turn a little bit more to trying to understand China. And Yvonne, you've already mentioned the difficulties of reporting on China. Ireland has a real shortage on experts on China. I mean, Alex and Ducalces and I have talked about this, that we are disproportionately asked by the Irish media for our opinion. Alex is asked more than I am, but I'm a historian. I shouldn't really be being asked all the time about contemporary.
Sorry about that.
Things. I'm happy to oblige, but there's a dearth of expertise here. And then, Yvonne, perhaps you could talk to us about the circumstances that you left China.
Yeah, so the circumstances, we were there for a decade, so it was a length of time. But really, it was the final few years where things started to become very difficult. We arrived in China just as Xi Jinping was coming to power in 2012. And if you remember at that point, people were very hopeful. I mean, it seems ridiculous looking back, but there was actually a feeling that this was a reformer and that things were going to open up and liberalize, and happy days, basically. But obviously that was put paid to as an idea fairly quickly. By the time we got to Beijing in 2015, 2016, it was very, very clear the direction that China was heading in. And as reporters, it became more and more difficult to even speak to ordinary Chinese people. There was a concern amongst Chinese people that if you were going to interview them and put them in the Western press, that there could be some consequences for them, and often there were. Then it became, when the Xinjiang story began to break and people understood that there was this mass construction of camp facilities across this Western province, and we started going out and filming these structures and reporting what was happening there, the Chinese government took issue with that kind of reporting and started trying to close it down. And in a very, it wasn't the only story, by the way, but it was really the most significant one. It started in a very measured way to begin with. It was about shortening your visa. It was about putting people on, because we'd have a 1-year visa, they'd put you on a 3-month visa. This is what happened to my husband, John, at the BBC. And then when that didn't work, because the Xinjiang stories kept coming out and the investigations kept becoming more in-depth, and really the horror of what was going on there was very well documented, then it would be a 1-month visa. And if you're living in China with a family, it's very difficult to be tied to a 1-month visa because you don't know if you're going to have to leave the following month. And this is an attempt, and it's a very effective attempt, to just put the squeezes on you and to say, listen, wouldn't you rather stay here for another month? Wouldn't you be better off not going and doing that story in Xinjiang and just staying in Beijing and doing something on the skyscrapers? And some journalists made that choice, no judgment, but we didn't. We felt that if we were in China, we were there to tell important stories. And that, again, the 1 month visas didn't work. And so the pressure began to ratchet up. And the authorities, because you have to go and visit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs regularly. You have to go in for your dressing down, your cup of tea. And at that point, they will tell you all of the terrible things that you've written about China and how you should really be much more positive. And why are you so biased against China? Why is your husband so biased against China? And you'd listen, and because it was a routine. But then it began to get a little bit more threatening when they started making legal threats. And they would say in these foreign ministry cup of teas, someone in Xinjiang, if you don't stop, might sue you. And as soon as you hear that, when you're living in China, you think, this is not joking anymore. This is actually could have very serious consequences. And we can't forget the context. In 2018, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were taken off the street in retaliation for the arrest of the Huawei CEO in Canada. We knew them. They were in our circle. So to see them disappear overnight put the frighteners on the Beijing press corps to such a huge extent. Richard O'Halloran, who you referenced, was taken. He was put in house arrest in Shanghai. I went to interview him. All of these incidences, Chung Lei, the Australian journalist, all of these incidences showed to us that China at that point didn't care what the international community thought. They had the ability to act with impunity. And if that meant locking up a pesky journalist to shut them up, they would be willing to do that. So we got to the stage where we thought to ourselves, listen, we like the story, we think it's important, but is it so important that we're willing to, run the risk of a possible detention? And we didn't know. I think the most unsettling thing was we didn't know what the red line was anymore. What was going to be the moment at which they said, we're not having you talking anymore, we have to silence you. So it also became much more difficult to live there because the BBC in particular was being written about in Chinese state media, and it was, as far as they were concerned, it was publishing fake news. And the teachers at our children's school were consuming this and reading this, and they stopped talking to us. And that's very difficult in a parent-teacher relationship if people won't even look at you. People in the expat community stopped talking to us. We were just persona non grata. And then it just, as well as the possible threat of something worse, it became that we were very paranoid, we were very, very anxious, which is exactly the intention. And we felt in the end that we couldn't take it anymore. And I actually feel pathetic telling you that because there are other people who stuck it out, and there are Chinese journalists sticking it out every day. But anyway, we decided, look, let's go, and we took the decision to get on a plane to Taiwan and spent many happy months in Taiwan, I have to say. So that's a potted history. But I'm not telling you all of this to say, oh, poor us, what a terrible experience. Actually, what's instructive about our experience is that when I left China, I was the last Irish journalist to leave. And since then, I know the Irish Times has since sent somebody in, but there was nobody covering China for an Irish audience. And now there's one person. There's lots of Chinese journalists in Ireland, lots of Chinese journalists in Europe, everywhere around the world. And we, as RTE and many other Irish outlets, we do not have the resources or the wherewithal to send people into China on a permanent basis as resident correspondents. Whereas Chinese state media has it in buckets, and they send Chinese journalists all around the world. And so we now have this enormous asymmetry of information that I think is a massive problem and needs to be addressed. I don't know what the answer is, but it's certainly worth a discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Could you speak to us about what you picked up while you're living in Taipei about Ireland's relationship with Taiwan, which again was referenced briefly this morning?
Ireland doesn't have a relationship with Taiwan, particularly. I think that Irish politicians, for the most part, are, not all of them, but for the most part, are terrified of even being seen with Taiwanese officials. I think whenever events are organised about Taiwan, and I would say this also about Xinjiang, certainly about Tibet, Irish politicians for the most part will run a mile. They'll have to explain that there are reasons themselves about that. It's very interesting when you're in Taiwan that there are other countries who are managing that relationship. They're able to maintain their one China policy, but still have a pretty sizable office in Taipei. Ireland doesn't have that. Yeah. So I think that is quite interesting, actually, because obviously the business links are still quite high with Taiwan, but there's no presence, very, very limited presence.
Thank you. And having talked about Taiwan, I wonder if, Finbarr, we could bring you in on Hong Kong and what it's like reporting on China from Hong Kong and how that picture is changing.
It's changed a lot. I was in Hong Kong when the national security law passed in 2020, and I remember the weeks afterwards I was receiving phone calls from folks that I'd interviewed like in the years prior, maybe like 3 years earlier. Hey, would you mind taking my name out of that story? You interviewed me a few years back. And I was like, no, I can't do that. But it was indicative of the change, and nobody really knew what the change would look like. The government was assuring us that it wouldn't be, the NSL wouldn't be applied retrospectively, which of course it was, of course. And so it has become more difficult. You've seen in the last couple of months, other bureau, I think New York Times and Wall Street Journal, starting to move their bureau out of Hong Kong. Used to be people would cover China from China, then China from Hong Kong, and now it's like Hong Kong and China from Seoul or Singapore or sometimes Taipei, but as someone described it to me, it's a bit like jumping from the frying pan to the fire. So yeah, it's not getting any easier, and it's only going to get worse. You've got so many great journalists covering China outside of China, and actually, in part, that's because China's more of a global story now. Like Dimitri in Washington, there's lots of people doing that in Washington, covering the US-China relationship. In Europe, it's actually quite few. There's myself and maybe one or two others. But I think that's the way it's going. We're all going to be worse off for that. There's so much we need to understand about China, but we're all very ignorant because the Chinese government has decided that we don't tell the China story well, which is basically in their own terms, and so they kick all the good journalists out. And it's frustrating that Dimitri and everyone remember a few years ago when the US government decided to kick out lots of Chinese journalists from Washington, which was so counterproductive. You could have seen it a mile off, because then the New York Times and all these guys got booted out of China. And really, what harm were those Xinhua guys doing in Washington, picking up public source information and relaying it back home? And it's frustrating, but it's not going to get any better. And I would hope that in the future there will be more people in Europe covering China as that story grows and as we see more Chinese presence here. But it depends whether editors are willing to put their money where where it should be.
Can I maybe bring Alexander and Ben into this conversation from a national security perspective in terms of where those Chinese experts in Ireland and elsewhere come from? I mean, obviously, we've not mentioned the Chinese Communist Party directly, but they are all going to be party members. Can you tell us what that means? What are the obligations on you as a member of the largest political party in the world? Anyone sent abroad in an official capacity will be a party member. So what do we need to know about that? And to what extent are Irish institutions under surveillance?
I think it's important to look at the change in China's amendment in their constitution around 2017, 2018 about the support for the Communist Party at the core of the state. And so this is more about the insertion of the party into the state, or not being able to see so much anymore, the separation between the two and this kind of meshing into one. And since that happened, and where you have this greater integration, there comes certain rules that follow along from that. And I suppose to put that more tangibly is, I'm going to speak about this more superficially, but regarding Chinese students who are on Chinese government scholarships in Europe, it's covered in a number of countries, that then they sign these agreements to receive this funding, that there is an expectation, or they actually sign to say that they will follow Chinese laws of the Chinese state while they're in another country. So they're following the rules of their own country while they could be in Ireland, for example. And so there are certain agreements between Irish universities and Chinese universities, and it's like, did we see that? Do we know that? Do we know what Chinese citizens are having to abide by while they're on Irish soil? And I think that's when it comes to issues of Ireland's lack of knowledge or competency in understanding what we're getting ourselves in with when we have these connectivities or interdependencies, and to borrow this phrase from earlier from Jake Sullivan, etc., of being clear-eyed. And I think that, you know, there are many things signed and agreed upon over the last 10, 15, 20 years where there was not an understanding of what exactly we are agreeing to.
I think beyond that, I mean, we've talked a couple of times about being clear-eyed. I think in the Irish case there's a willful blindness, a willful refusal to look at realities in the face. And I have to bring this down. I mean, you brought the conversation down to the practical level. I mean, I look at, for example, academic engagement with China. I mean, essentially what you're seeing is universities desperate for income, desperate to pay salaries and keep the lights on, becoming a small export industry. And a big export market is China.
Yep.
So my institution has set up campuses and institutions in China. It is chasing Chinese students on a daily basis through so-called global engagement. And we also have an institution called the Confucius Institute, part paid for by the Chinese government on our campus. That has led to the most egregious examples, which my university, and I can only speak for my university, has paid willful blindness. So, for example, I've had young career colleagues whose contracts depend on teaching in China, being told that references to Taiwan or Hong Kong are unpatriotic, unacceptable, and demanding public apologies in lecture theatres in Beijing for mentioning those entities.
Wow.
I have had younger career colleagues told which textbook to use because certain textbooks, obviously, and this is the publishers, of course, elide references to Hong Kong or Taiwan as entities. I have had examples of, again, early career precarious colleagues who are teaching at the Confucius Institute, but who do not have the same level of guarantee of academic freedom. They're not integrated in language departments. They're not integrated in the normal college structures. They are employees of something called the Confucius Institute. Now, I don't want to get into the internal dynamics of the Confucius Institute. That is a matter between my university and the state agency they signed the agreement with. But what I will say is that these are young, precarious colleagues who, by virtue of the specific examples I know, have to self-censor themselves, and who, and this is a truly bizarre situation, staff of the Confucius Institute teaching Chinese politics to UCD undergraduates. My school, the School of Politics and International Relations, offered at our own expense to teach Chinese politics through the good offices of my colleague and others. And no, the university insists that the Confucius Institute will teach Chinese politics. Now, they call it something different. They call it Chinese culture and government or Chinese, the contemporary, whatever they want to call it, but they are ostensibly teaching Chinese politics to undergraduates. It's an extraordinary situation, but it is one of willful blindness. Yeah. Now, the university, and I'm being very frank here, the university has now created sort of a Potemkin village to cover the Confucius Institute by creating something called the Irish Institute for Chinese Studies. Well, I'm very sorry, but there are no Chinese experts in the Irish Institute for Chinese Studies hosted by UCD. And this is not a problem unique to UCD. It is perhaps most egregious, but it is not unique. Your own university refused an honorary degree to the Dalai Lama. Why? Because the provost of TCD was concerned about the adverse Chinese reaction. We see today a newspaper article in the Examiner about our colleagues in UCC expressing concern about an agreement with a Chinese university. But Irish universities willfully refuse to look the problem in the face, identify it, and deal with it. And their excuse, quite frankly, is the fact that, well, the minister has given us no guidance. The government doesn't mind. The government encourages us to engage with China. So willful blindness multiplied on willful blindness leads, I think, to a very serious problem.
I agree with that, I have to say. Whilst you're quite right, the Trinity is far from perfect on this, I do look at UCD with particular concern with the way they've been exposed to the Confucius Institute, the huge investment and it is a branch of the Chinese state, and those staff are employed under Chinese law, which as far as I'm concerned is a breach of EU employment law. They cannot be follows the Falun Gong, for example. Well, should we not mean that anyone employed in the EU has freedom of religious conscience, for example? So there's serious issues in higher education.
Forgive me for interrupting, but all of the Chinese staff who were employed in the Confucius Institute to teach China and to teach Chinese studies, their visas are contingent on what they're doing in place.
Yeah.
You also have the issue of the so-called patriotic student associations. We had an experience some months back. Alex very kindly brought somebody in to talk about the situation in Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. I had 3 emails, remarkably similarly worded, from patriotic young Chinese students, threatening me with reporting me to the university authorities for things that I had said or tweets that I had made with respect to this. Now again, if I was an unestablished, precarious younger colleague looking to maintain my contract, I don't want to be complained about by patriotic Chinese students for things that I have said either publicly or in my classroom. But that is a real and live act of concern.
What was your reply?
Very short. Positively Anglo-Saxon.
And I do think there's an issue here with the Chinese embassy in Dublin being particularly eagle-eyed because the field of Chinese studies is so small in Ireland. They can watch everything we are doing. And so I was hauled in for a meeting with officials from the Chinese embassy for a public lecture I was giving on the campus at Trinity as part of the Chinese New Year festival celebrations. And I don't think that would happen in many other European countries because you couldn't do that because there'd be so much going on. But because we're such a tiny sector, it actually feeds into the potential for that. And to be fair to our then provost, they complained to him about my lecture, and he said to me, "You must be doing something right if they're annoyed." So there is quiet pushback, but there's no way he would have said that to their faces.
But then contrast that with the way the Irish state responds to a similar instance. Again, we had a colleague in UCD who published an article in let's call it a journal. It was published by the Department of Defense, the Defense Review. It moves from university to university, and academic always does. It was peer reviewed, and the whole schmeal. And a colleague published an article in that. Our UCD colleague published an article in this journal about Huawei and its exposure and national security issues there too. The complaint from Huawei was that this was not academic, not appropriate, anti-Chinese, et cetera, But the point is the reaction, because the official from Huawei secured a meeting with the Secretary General of the Department of Defense to complain about an Irish academic's article in a journal. Now, why in God's name did the Secretary General of the Department of Defense take that meeting? But she did. Yeah. To clarify, entre guillemets, that particular journal and what was in it did not reflect Irish government policy. But the fact of that meeting is scandalous.
It is. Now, we could keep going like this, I think, for the rest of the day. I'm very keen to open the conversation to the floor for our final 10 minutes. I'm sure that there are questions. So I see a red arm at the back there. Do you want to stand up and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gerlinde Greutel, University of Regensburg, Germany. Thank you so much for your frank words. And it triggers a question, what do you do about it? Do you have any thoughts on how to improve the situation and stop the kowtowing that you've described in various fields? Thank you.
We might take 2 more questions as time is short, so just there.
Hey, my name is Richard Turčani, Palacký University, Czech Republic. Similar question to this. Hearing these stories, I wonder, are they reported in Irish media? And because we actually experience similar things in Slovakia, Czech Republic, And actually, when these stories get to media, it attracts a lot of attention, and in a way, it pushes also government and to do something about that. So I wonder if it gets reported, if not, why, and if yes, if there is any follow-up.
Thank you. And there was a question just in front there. Yeah.
I'm wondering, given the fact that I've heard Micheál Martin do the same speech in 2008, 2011, and as somebody who worked in the Irish Institute of Chinese Studies before they became the the Confucius Institutes, I'm wondering if it's not just a case that it's willful ignorance, but it's actually direct government policy, because I do remember when the funding was pulled for the Irish Institutes and we were told to replace it with external funding, not clearly being told highway funding, that this is a policy, given the fact that this is the 4th China-Ireland conference that I've attended, that it's nothing has actually changed, and that's therefore it's government policy to have this long-term ambiguity and to not fund Chinese expertise deliberately in China, in Ireland.
Thank you. Yvonne and Finbarr on the first two questions.
What do we do about it? I mean, I think from a journalist's perspective, as I spoke about the fact that we can't comfortably get people into China and to stay in China, it's not only a question of resources, although that's a massive issue. It's a question of priorities. So if I speak to my newsroom, you're going to send journalists to other parts of the world before you start talking about China. And we don't see China in our kind of media culture as a lead story, sadly. And I think that is the first thing that needs to change. I think we need to understand why this matters and why it's coming down the tracks, and why if we don't develop our expertise and if we don't put journalists on the ground and academics and what have you, then we are facing the dearth of information that we currently have is detrimental. So I think that's the first thing. But I also think this, bringing together whatever is now a very small pool of expertise in Ireland and trying to expand it is exactly the direction we need to be heading in. And perhaps this is an opportunity to discuss what resources are going to be required as we go forward to consolidate, what this burgeoning expertise may look like. Who's going to house it? Who's going to fund it? What can we learn from other countries who've done something similar? Because we are kind of starting from scratch, which is ridiculous, but it has not been a priority to date. That would be my approach to it.
Well, first thing I would say is, how much agency does Ireland have in this? Ireland may have to change course because of things that are very out of its hands, right? So the US-China rivalry, which is growing and growing, all those nice chip exports may evaporate if Intel isn't any longer allowed to sell those to China. The agricultural stuff we talked about, the vaccine stuff, if Wuxi runs into trouble in that sense, if there's tensions between rising tensions between China and Taiwan, and Europe is forced into taking some sort of export controls or sanctions. The truth is, Ireland, somebody described it the kowtowing. I don't know if I'd say that, but the general atmosphere of ambivalence towards China and ambiguity and let's just make as much money out of this as we can. I mean, that gravy train's going to stop eventually. And that's the reality. I mean, whether Ireland wants to do anything about it in advance, I don't know. It may not even need to. It might be just taken out of your hands. And so that's what I would go back to initially. But the second point would be the European agenda. The de-risking agenda is going to move forward in the next Commission. And so Ireland has hitched its wagon to Brussels vis-a-vis China policy. And we're going to see that become a bit more hawkish. I mean, we're all expecting that von der Leyen will be back for a second term in office. I don't think it'll ever be quite as extreme as the United States, but it's certainly moving in a certain direction. It's very clear. So, I think Ireland is maybe slightly behind the times, but the times will eventually come to Ireland.
Yeah, I think talking about what to do, and also as a report in the media, I think a really good example is the story from Huawei a couple of years ago about the terminology in an Irish bill or what became an act, I think it's the Telecommunications Act, from the word of high-risk vendor, which was changed to relevant vendor. And this was a debate between departments within Irish government, one looking for a stricter terming of high-risk vendor, one looking for a softer one called relevant vendor. And this debate and this kind of or misalignment between Irish departments is, to me, very problematic. It was reported, but you really had to read between the lines and read closely. And so when it comes to de-risking and looking at certain issues, my call for is a cross-cutting departmental coordination mechanism, where the departments convene on China, discussing what their relationship is with China, what they're working on, and for a coordination and alignment on that. Because if you have a number of meetings of a Minister for Agriculture and going to China, and no meetings between the technology department or an economic department or something of the Department of the Taoiseach where national security is more, there is this misalignment, and that is not something that would go unnoticed by the Chinese state. I think you make a good point, Finbarr, about Ireland's level of agency. It is restricted. Again, we are between US-China rivalry. I do see Ireland as a site of that, but I think carving out some level of strategic autonomy, and by doing that through a mechanism within government, is a important but first step to addressing some of the issues.
I'm a firm believer in cock-up rather than conspiracy in terms of how the world works. These things are being reported. You know yourself, they're being reported, they're being talked about, they cause a splash when they happen, and then there's deafening silence. And it comes back to the fact that the state does not take security seriously. The state does not take its own defense seriously. It doesn't take these big strategic issues particularly seriously until the rubber hits the road and choices have to be made. And if from the, to reverse the argument on myself, for a small country, it doesn't want to have to make choices. It wants maximum wriggle room. It wants to move, to dodge, to duck and weave and get as much out of the system as it possibly can, because normally it can get very little out of the system because it has no power. So I have no antipathy to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Irish governments for taking this strategy. All I'm saying is that the strategy has very serious risks that are adverse to Irish national interests, certainly adverse to Irish national values, and certainly diminish Ireland's standing and role and reputation in the world. And if the government were to take it seriously, I think other institutions would take it seriously. But it is something that, as of this moment in time, nobody takes seriously.
We'll have 3 more questions, and then we'll have to close. There's one here. Sorry, no, this gentleman first, and then I'll come to you.
I welcome everything that I've heard today. Hello, I'm emeritus professor from UCD. I've been working with China, in researching with China, but also working with the Institute for Chinese Studies and the Confucius Institute. And I welcome everything. There's so much you've been revealing and taking the lid off things, particularly yourself about China and the difficulties even I have continuing to work with people in China because we can't talk about certain things. The only exception I'd like to make is some of the points that were made about the Confucius Institute and the Institute of Chinese Studies. I've been working with them for many decades, and they are not the enemy. There may be, issues. I mean, you have uncovered many enemies, but these are very, very fine people, and I just want to emphasize that.
Thank you.
Please don't I insist on coming back. Don't misunderstand me. Not a whisper of criticism against any of those staff, but they're precarious staff. They're short-term contract staff. They're not properly integrated in university structures. They are vulnerable. And the university does not take their vulnerability seriously.
I really want to echo what Professor Tonra said. So I'm from Hong Kong, teaching in the U.S. I've been talking to Hong Kong people living in Ireland, and essentially they face very severe threats. For example, people protested outside Trinity College. They were threatened by mainland Chinese students with chains and threatening them. And then when they try to organize a documentary screening of She's in Jail, they are so afraid that everyone needs to work essentially anonymously. And then at the same time, even when Hong Kong students want to create students' club, they are told to join the Chinese club.
Yes.
And then Hong Kong students want to create their, what they really want to study the GCSE exam in traditional characters. Yeah. They are told that no, you can only answer in simplified characters. So the first thing I see when I walk in the hotel is Irish water. If water has to be labeled as Irish in this particular country, this country really should value why people want to maintain the distinctive identities. So how does the government actually, contribute to this preservation of diversity is very important. I also have a question for the SCMP. The SCMP is known that now these days when you read it, you flip through the pages, it reads like the People's Daily. So I'm just curious, what kind of pressure, maybe you can't really say it in public, but thank you.
Thank you. And one final question, about two final questions from the front and from Steve Sang. Thank you.
I wanted to press you a little bit, Ben, because I think you raised really important issue. But to me, the problem isn't so much that the Chinese are doing what they are doing. That's what they do. The issue is what Ireland as a country is prepared and willing to do. So what will it take? I mean, China is not in the public imagination of people in this country. And therefore, politicians and government officials can steer the way that you have described them. So what will it take to capture the imagination that this country needs to take its national security issue seriously in the way that you have described? Can China be it? Can Russia be it? Or something else?
Thank you. And our keynote, Dimitri.
Just a quick question. I mean, in the US, there was an explosion in Chinese studies and Chinese language studies over the last roughly 20 years. It's kind of tapering off now, leveling out, and in some places falling because people are thinking actually learning Chinese may not be good for your future. What's the kind of situation at universities in Ireland? How much interest is there in China? Is it going up or going down?
It's certainly for Trinity, it's going down. We launched the MPhil Chinese Studies in 2015, expecting it to be something that would have increasing numbers of Irish students. The vast majority of the students taking it are Chinese because they see it as an easy way of getting an English language degree. We have very little. Each year we tend to have one Irish student taking it. So and the thing is, I think it is, people want to learn about Japan because of manga and anime. You need a positive narrative to attract student interest. Why would you want to learn about a country where the only coverage is negative? There is in one way I agree that there's a lack of consideration for China in the public imagination here. But I think it's changing with the generations. A retired professor from Trinity, whose latest publication was a history of the provosts of Trinity up to 1914, when he asked what I did for a living, replied, "Oh, that's esoteric." No word of an exaggeration there. But on the other hand, articles in the Irish Times on China are normally in the top 5 read category on the website. So there is public interest, particularly at the Hong Kong issue, really attracts a lot of interest here. So I think the government ought to pay attention to that. But I defer to the panelists for the final word.
Just on your question, what would it take? I think that there are two choices. It's either leadership or crisis. Leadership, thus far, we have been lacking. Crisis, unfortunately, is perhaps the only point at which any of this is taken seriously. And again, and I say this to my international students in particular, for 800 years, Ireland was crucified by its geostrategic position. We have had an idyllic situation only for the last 80. So I'm not going to criticize the Irish state for not taking full advantage of the last 80 years of a very benign geostrategic situation. But things are changing, and people do need to wake up and see those changes.
I'll answer the lady's question. Respectfully disagree with your characterization of the newspaper. I'm not going to dispute your right to think that as a Hong Konger, but I will always sit here and defend my own work, which I think stands up to scrutiny. It's fair, balanced, and I have no pressure to report or not report anything, and I think anybody who reads my journalism will see that quite clearly.
And just to back that up, as someone coming from a China think tank sanctioned by a think tank that focuses on China that is sanctioned by the Chinese state. We work closely with Finbarr and we read his work and would back that up.
Okay. Did you want a final word, Yvonne?
Yeah, I mean, the South China Morning Post is a go-to newspaper on China-US relations, China-Europe relations. It's also expanding its operation into the US, and it's still seen, certainly in an international context, as a very well-respected paper. In a Hong Kong context, perhaps things are slightly different on the ground, given the change in the law. Would you say that's fair?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the newspaper. I'm not going to defend every piece that's in there, but I would probably agree with your characterisation. And again, I no disrespect to you at all. I respect your view, but I disagree with it.
I think probably seeing a change in reporting on Hong Kong, it would be an exaggeration to say it's the same as the People's Daily, but the change would be, I think, hard to see. Yeah.
And just on the point about Chinese students in Ireland, I think is really important to remember as well that when Chinese students go overseas anywhere, they are looking over their shoulders all the time. It's very, very precarious. I mean, you leave China, but China doesn't leave you. So you have to remember, to your point, Ben, I mean, there's a huge amount of vulnerability for the Chinese diaspora. And you have to... a lot of Chinese students, for example, will not take particular courses because they know there's another student on that course who's going to report back on them. And we did a story a few years ago now, and actually I need to update this. But the Chinese Ministry of Education helped to handpick an advisor to the Chinese language program in Irish schools, and that advisor would oversee the Chinese language curriculum that was going to be rolled out in secondary schools in Ireland. And at the time, I wrote a story on it because it struck me as something quite significant. And the people, the civil servants I engaged with on that story could not see what the issue was. And my question was, do you know whether this person, for example, is a party member? And they said to me, well, why would that matter? Why would I ask what her political affiliations?
Of course she was.
Yeah,
she must have
I mean,
been.
she's handpicked by the Ministry of Education. So, so it's that kind of thing. I think there was a tendency, certainly in the past, and maybe things are changing slowly, that China was treated as any other country, but we have little understanding of what a one-party state is and the omnipresence of the party, whether you're a Chinese student sitting in a classroom on the other side of the world, or a journalist or anything else. It's everywhere.
I'll close the panel with this. I had a student on the MP Chinese Studies this year, Chinese, who was the most explicitly pro Xi Jinping that I've had. And we have a full range. We have plenty of students who really take the opportunity of studying abroad to be surprisingly critical, even speaking in the seminar, not just in their essays. But this student introduced herself to me as being here to seek truth from facts, which is a Mao slogan. It's... I did not self-censor, but were I a Chinese national, I don't think I could have helped but self-censor in the face of that. And I was amazed, actually, by how open students continue to be, some of them, in their critical voices on China, taking advantage of the fact that they are in Ireland. So that is some bravery that we see among Chinese nationals here. Thank you so much to the panelists. I think that was a fantastic...